Inside the grand halls of the Hawthorne Academy for Music, the air always smelled of lemon polish and expensive old wood. For most students, this smell meant comfort and prestige. It meant they were exactly where they belonged. But for Illyra, it was a constant reminder that she was an outsider. She walked through the crowded hallway with her head down, clutching the handle of her violin case until her knuckles turned white. While the other students laughed and compared their weekends, she kept her eyes on the floor, counting the tiles, trying to make herself invisible. Hawthorne Academy was a school for the wealthy and the gifted. Illyra was definitely gifted, but she was certainly not wealthy. She was there on a rare, hard-fought scholarship, a pity case as the whispers in the corridor often suggested. Her mother worked 2 cleaning jobs just to keep the lights on at home, and the uniform Illyra wore was a hand-me-down from the school's lost and found bin, slightly faded and worn at the cuffs. But the biggest difference between Illyra and the other students was what she carried in her hands. Most of the kids here walked around with sleek, fiberglass cases that glinted under the chandeliers, protecting instruments worth more than most cars. Illyra's case was different. It was an old, battered canvas thing covered in scratches, held together by duct tape in one corner. It looked like it had survived a war. When Illyra reached the orchestra room, the noise was deafening. 20 or 30 students were warming up, creating a chaotic storm of sound. Cellos roared, flutes twittered, and violins screeched. Illyra found her spot in the back row, the seat assigned to the least important players. She didn't take her violin out immediately. She just sat there, listening. She loved the way the sounds blended together, but she also felt a heavy knot of anxiety in her stomach. Every time she walked into this room, she felt like she was walking into a lion's den. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors swung shut with a loud bang that echoed through the room. The chaotic noise stopped instantly, replaced by a terrified silence. Mr. Thorne had arrived. He was a tall, thin man with silver hair and a face that looked permanently frozen in a frown. He walked with a cane, though he didn't need it for walking. He used it to tap on students' chairs or music stands when they made a mistake. He believed that music was not an art, but a strict discipline, and he had no patience for anyone he considered beneath the standard of the academy. Mr. Thorne walked down the center aisle, his eyes scanning the rows of students like a hawk looking for a mouse. He looked impeccable in his tailored suit, radiating an air of superiority that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. He stopped at the front of the room and turned to face them, tapping his cane rhythmically against the floor. "Today," he said, his voice sharp and cutting, "we see who actually belongs in this room and who is just wasting oxygen." A shiver went down Illyra's spine. She kept her eyes on her music stand, praying he would just start the rehearsal and ignore the back row. But Mr. Thorne wasn't in a merciful mood. He began walking up the rows, listening to individuals play a few notes. When he stopped next to a boy with a shiny new cello, the boy played beautifully, and Thorne gave a curt, satisfied nod. But as he moved further back, his expression darkened. He stopped in front of Illyra. She could feel his presence looming over her. She could smell the expensive cologne he wore. She refused to look up, staring instead at the scratched wood of her violin case tucked under her chair. "You," Thorne said. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Illyra flinched. She slowly raised her head. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure the person next to her could hear it. "Why yes, Mr. Thorne," she whispered. "We have been practicing this section for 2 weeks, Thorne said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And yet, every time we play, I hear a delay coming from this corner. A hesitation. A lack of confidence. "I'm sorry, sir," Ilora stammered. "I'm trying." "Trying is for people who lack talent," Thorn snapped. "Why is your instrument still in its case? Are you too good to warm up with the rest of us, or is it that you are ashamed of what you are holding?" A few students nearby giggled softly. Ilora's face turned hot with humiliation. She reached down and pulled the old canvas case onto her lap. She fumbled with the zippers, her hands shaking, and finally pulled out her violin. It was a beautiful instrument, despite its age. The wood was a deep, warm honey color, but it had nicks and scratches all over it. The varnish was peeling in places. It looked ancient next to the pristine instruments of her peers. Mr. Thorne let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. He reached out and took the violin from her hands with just 2 fingers, as if it were dirty. He held it up to the light, inspecting it with a look of disgust on his face. "Look at this," he announced to the entire room, turning around so everyone could see the battered instrument. "This is a relic. A piece of junk. How do you expect to produce a sound that matters with this?" The class went silent. No one laughed now, it was too cruel. Ilora felt tears stinging the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She bit her lip, hard. "This is a school of excellence," Thorne continued, handing the violin back to her roughly. "We create art here. We do not play on broken toys." He leaned in close to her face, his voice lowering to a menacing hiss that only she could hear. "I know why you are here, girl. The school needed to fill a quota. But don't think for a second that means you belong. You are taking up space that a real musician could use." Ilora took the violin, her hands trembling violently. She felt small. She felt worthless. She wanted to run out of the room and never come back. "Now," Thorne said, straightening up and addressing the class again. "Since our scholarship student is so unprepared, perhaps she needs a lesson in humility. Play the G major scale. Now." "Alone." Ilora froze. The room was dead silent. Every pair of eyes was on her. The spotlight felt like a physical weight on her shoulders. She lifted the violin to her chin. She positioned the bow. But her hand wouldn't stop shaking. The fear of Mr. Thorne, the fear of the other students judging her, and the shame of her poverty all mixed together into a paralyzing panic. She took a deep breath and tried to draw the bow across the strings. But instead of a clear, musical note, a horrible, screeching sound came out. It was the sound of raw nerves and terror. Thorne threw his hands up in the air. "Stop! Stop!" he yelled. "That is exactly what I expected. Cats fighting in an alley sounds better than that." He walked back to the podium, shaking his head in disappointment. "That will be all from you today. Put the toy away. Just sit there and try not to ruin the rest of the rehearsal for the people who actually have a future." Ilora lowered the violin. She put it back in the case, zipped it up as fast as she could, and sat staring at the floor. The rehearsal started up again without her. The music swelled, loud and confident. But to Ilora, it was just noise. She sat in the back row, feeling invisible, but for the first time, a tiny spark of anger began to burn deep inside her chest. It was a small feeling, but it was there. He thought she was nothing. He thought her violin was junk. But he didn't know the truth. He didn't know where that violin came from, and he certainly didn't know what Ilora could do when she wasn't afraid. The walk home that afternoon felt longer than usual. The city buses were crowded, and Ilora had to squeeze into a seat near the back, clutching her battered violin case on her lap. Outside the window, the gray buildings rushed by in a blur. She kept her head down, replaying the scene in the orchestra room over and over again. Mr. Thorne's voice echoing in her head, calling her instrument a toy. The laughter of the other students. It made her stomach churn with a mix of shame and a hot, prickly anger that she wasn't used to feeling. When she finally unlocked the door to her small apartment, the smell of her mother's cooking greeted her. It was a comforting smell, spices and lentils, but today it couldn't calm her nerves. Her mother called out from the tiny kitchen, asking how her day was. Ilora forced a smile that her mother couldn't see and shouted back that it was fine. She didn't want to worry her. Her mother worked so hard to keep the lights on, scrubbing floors in office buildings late into the night. Ilora knew how much the scholarship meant to her. It was supposed to be their ticket to a better life. Ilora went to her room, which was barely bigger than a closet. She set the old violin case on her bed and sat beside it. For a long time, she just stared at the wall. She wanted to quit. She wanted to walk into Mr. Thorne's office tomorrow and hand over the violin and tell him he was right. But then, she looked at the photo on her nightstand. It was a picture of her grandfather, the man who had given her the violin. He had told her, just days before he passed away, that this violin held magic if she was brave enough to let it out. She opened the case. The violin looked tired, the wood dull, but she ran her fingers gently over the strings. She closed her eyes and played a few notes. Not because she had to, but because she needed to hear them. In the quiet of her bedroom, with no one watching, her hands didn't shake. The sound that came out was rich and warm, nothing like the squeak from earlier in the class. She realized then that Mr. Thorne hadn't mocked her because she couldn't play. He had mocked her because he thought she was too scared to play. The next morning at school, the atmosphere in the hallway was electric. Large, glossy posters had been taped to the walls overnight. The annual spring gala, they read in gold letters. This was the biggest event of the year. Parents, donors, and even critics from the city newspapers would be there. For the music students, it was the night they had been working toward all year. For Ilora, it had always just been a date on the calendar she hoped to survive. When she walked into the orchestra room, the tension was thicker than usual. Everyone was whispering. Mr. Thorne was standing at the podium, looking more severe than ever. He was tapping his watch impatiently. The students scrambled to their seats, terrified of being late. Today, the rehearsal was a disaster. The sound was messy and unfocused. Every time they tried to play the difficult piece they had been practicing, someone made a mistake. Mr. Thorne stopped them every few seconds, his face turning a darker shade of red. "Stop! Stop!" he yelled, throwing his baton onto the music stand. It bounced off with a loud clatter that made everyone jump. "This is unacceptable. Do you think the donors want to hear this noise? You sound like a broken radio. There is no passion. There is no precision." He walked down the aisle, glaring at the students. "I realize now what the problem is. We are trying to perform as a group, but the foundation is weak. We have weak links dragging down the strong." The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Ilora kept her eyes on her sheet music, praying he wouldn't stop at her row. But she saw his shoes stop right in front of her chair. "I have been thinking," Mr. Thorne said, his voice suddenly dangerously calm. "Perhaps the issue is that some of you are hiding behind the sound of others. You think you can get away with mediocrity because the person next to you is playing loud enough to cover you up." He looked directly at Ilora. "So, I have decided to make a change to the program for the gala. In the middle of the orchestral performance, we will stop. And we will have a special solo performance. Ilara's heart stopped. A solo, Ilara, he said. Her head snapped up. You will perform a solo for the guests, he announced, loud enough for the entire room to hear. A ripple of shock went through the students. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. She couldn't even speak. But, sir, she whispered, her voice trembling. I haven't prepared a solo. I have prepared one for you, Mr. Thorne said smoothly. He pulled a stack of papers from his jacket pocket and placed it on her music stand. This is Zijayunarwezen by Sarah Sate. Ilara looked at the music. Her eyes widened in horror. She knew this piece. It was legendary. It was one of the most difficult pieces ever written for the violin. It was fast, furious, and required incredible technique. The black notes on the page looked like a swarm of angry ants, impossible to read, let alone play. Sir, I can't play this, she stammered. It's too hard. I need months to learn it. 3 days, Mr. Thorne corrected her coldly. You have 3 days until the gala. The students around her shifted uncomfortably. They knew how hard that song was. Some of them looked at her with pity, while others looked relieved that they weren't in her shoes. You expect me to perform this on Friday? Ilara asked, her voice rising slightly in panic. I expect you to prove you deserve to be in this school, Thorne shot back. He leaned down, getting close to her face again. You sit in the back row, hiding behind that old violin, contributing nothing. This is your chance to step up. Unless, of course, you think you aren't good enough. Is that it, or are you admitting that you are just a charity student who doesn't belong here? He didn't give her a chance to answer. He turned to the rest of the class. She will play on Friday night. And if she fails, and she likely will, it will be a lesson to all of you about what happens when you don't practice hard enough. He walked back to the podium. Class dismissed. Ilara, stay here. Look at the music. One by one, the other students packed up their instruments. They walked past her quickly, avoiding eye contact. No one wanted to be associated with the girl Mr. Thorne had decided to sacrifice. When the room was finally empty, the silence felt heavy. Ilara sat alone on her chair, looking at the impossible music in front of her. Mr. Thorne was packing his briefcase at the front of the room. He didn't look at her. You can go now, he said dismissively. Don't waste my time tomorrow. If you can't play it, don't bother coming to the stage. Ilara stood up slowly. She packed her violin away with shaky hands, but as she zipped up the case, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, clawing at her throat. But under the fear, she felt a different fire ignite. He was setting her up. He wanted her to crash and burn in front of everyone. He wanted to humiliate her so badly that she would leave the school voluntarily. She walked toward the door. Just as she reached it, she stopped. She turned to look at Mr. Thorne. I will play it, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Mr. Thorne looked up, surprised by her voice. He smirked. We shall see. Ilara walked out of the room and into the hallway. She didn't go to the cafeteria for lunch. She didn't go to the library. She walked out the back doors of the school and sat on a concrete bench in the garden. It was chilly, but she didn't feel it. She took the music he had given her out of her pocket. It looked intimidating. It looked impossible. But then she closed her eyes and she listened. She remembered the rhythm of the song. It was wild, like a gypsy dance. It was unpredictable. It wasn't the kind of music that followed rules. It was the kind of music that broke them. She realized then that Mr. Thorne didn't know who she really was. He only saw the cheap clothes and the quiet girl in the back. He didn't see the girl who stayed up late practicing by candlelight when the electricity bill couldn't be paid. He didn't see the girl who played to forget her hunger. He didn't know that her grandfather had taught her that music wasn't about the price of the instrument, but about the soul of the player. Ilora stood up. She gripped the music in her hand. She was going to learn this piece. She was going to practice until her fingers bled, if she had to. Not to please Mr. Thorne, but to save herself. She was going to play this song, and when she did, she was going to make sure that the quiet girl disappeared forever. It was time to fight back. It was time to let the music speak for her. The night of the big recital arrived faster than Ilora wanted. The outside of the school was transformed. Usually, the gray stone building looked cold and uninviting, but tonight, it was glowing. Massive spotlights swept across the sky, and the entrance was lined with red velvet ropes. Fancy cars, long black ones and shiny silver ones, pulled up one after another, dropping off important people in expensive jewelry and tailored suits. Ilora arrived early, hiding in the shadows of the backstage curtains. She wore the only nice dress she owned, a simple blue dress that her mother had hemmed for her. It was clean and pressed, but next to the shimmering gowns of the other girls, it felt like a costume. She felt out of place, like a bird that had accidentally flown into a glass palace. The air backstage smelled of hairspray, nervous sweat, and expensive perfume. Everyone was rushing around, tuning instruments and fixing bow ties. But nobody looked at Ilora. She was just the quiet girl in the corner, the one everyone tried to avoid because they knew what was coming. She could hear the murmuring of the crowd outside the curtain. It was a low hum of voices, the sound of hundreds of people chatting. It sounded like the ocean, scary and powerful. Ilora's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She clutched her violin case, her palms sweaty. For the last 3 days, she had barely slept. She had practiced until her fingers were raw and her neck hurt. She knew the music now. She knew every note, every pause, every change in tempo. But knowing it in her messy bedroom and playing it in front of these people were two very different things. Mr. Thorne walked by, looking sharp in his tuxedo. He didn't even glance at her. He just checked his pocket watch and walked onto the stage. The orchestra members scrambled to take their places. Ilora watched from the wings, her stomach twisting into knots. She felt like she was going to be sick. The lights in the auditorium dimmed. The murmuring of the crowd stopped instantly. A spotlight hit the center of the stage, illuminating Mr. Thorne. He raised his arms, and the music began. For the next 40 minutes, Ilora watched from the darkness. The orchestra played beautifully. It was the kind of music that made you want to hold your breath. They played a complicated symphony, and when the final note faded into the air, the audience erupted. The applause was thunderous, a wave of sound that crashed against the walls. People stomped their feet and whistled. The musicians stood up to take their bow, beaming with pride. They looked like they were floating. They belonged here. But Ilora knew the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Mr. Thorne raised his hand to quiet the orchestra, signaling them to sit back down. He turned to face the audience, stepping closer to the edge of the stage. He didn't look nervous. He looked like he was in total control. He held a small stack of papers in his hand, and he tapped the microphone to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming through the speakers, smooth and confident. "Thank you for that generous applause. Our students have worked incredibly hard to perfect that challenging piece." He paused for effect, looking around the room. The spotlight reflected off his silver hair. "However," he continued, and his tone changed slightly. "It became harder, colder. Here at Hawthorne, we believe that true excellence is not just about playing the notes written on the page. It is about grit. It is about the ability to face pressure. And tonight, I want to show you something different. A little experiment, if you will." A hush fell over the crowd. Illyra felt her knees go weak. She leaned against the heavy velvet curtain for support. "We have many students here who have had the best teachers since they were toddlers," Thorne said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "They have the best instruments, the best resources. But I sometimes wonder, is talent born, or is it made? Can someone with nothing, truly create something?" He turned his head toward the wings where Illyra was hiding. "Please, come out," he said. It wasn't a polite invitation. It was an order. Illyra forced herself to move. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. She took a shaky breath and stepped out of the darkness and into the blinding white light. The audience gasped. It was a quiet, collective intake of breath. It wasn't a gasp of admiration. They were looking at her dress, her simple shoes, and most of all, the battered violin in her hands. She looked tiny under the massive spotlight. She looked like a child lost in a department store. Mr. Thorne walked over to her. "This is Illyra," he announced to the room. "Illyra is one of our scholarship students. She has had, shall we say, a very different path than our other performers. She does not have a Stradivarius. She does not have a private tutor waiting at home." He laughed softly, and a few people in the audience chuckled nervously along with him. "She has prepared a very difficult piece for you tonight," Thorne lied, knowing he had given her impossible music just days ago. "She will play Zajayunarwezin. It is a piece that requires immense soul. I thought it would be educational for you to hear." He looked at Illyra with a look that said, "Go ahead and fail." He walked over to the piano bench and sat down, crossing his legs. He didn't pick up his violin. He wasn't going to accompany her. He was just going to sit there and watch her crash and burn. He wanted the audience to watch the charity case struggle. Illyra stood alone in the center of the vast stage. The silence was heavy. It pressed against her ears. She looked out into the crowd, but the lights were too bright. She couldn't see their faces, only a wall of darkness. She could feel hundreds of eyes staring at her, judging her. She saw a few people in the front row lean over to whisper to each other. One man took a sip of his drink, looking bored already. They were expecting a joke. They were waiting for the squeak, the mistake, the proof that she didn't belong. She felt the urge to run. She could turn around, rush back to the wings, grab her bag, and just leave. She could go home and never come back. Mr. Thorne would win, but at least the humiliation would be over. She looked down at her violin. It looked so small and old in her hands. But then, she remembered the last 3 nights. She remembered the anger she felt when she looked at the music. She remembered her grandfather's voice telling her that the music was inside her, not the wood. She adjusted the violin under her chin. It felt familiar. It felt like an extension of her own body. She tightened her grip on the bow. The crowd was silent, waiting for the entertainment. Mr. Thorne was sitting still, his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. Ilora closed her eyes for a split second. She blocked out the lights. She blocked out the whispers. She stopped hearing the low hum of the air conditioning. She imagined she was back in her bedroom, safe and alone. She let the anger at Mr. Thorne rise up in her chest, mixing with the adrenaline, turning into pure focus. She wasn't going to play for them. She wasn't going to play to impress the donors or the principal. She was going to play for herself. She was going to show them that you don't need a shiny violin to have a voice. She lifted the bow. The audience held their breath. Mr. Thorne leaned forward slightly, expecting the disaster to begin. The silence stretched on for one more second. And then, Ilora's hand moved. The bow touched the strings. It wasn't a hesitant touch. It was firm, determined. The first note that exploded into the auditorium wasn't the screeching mess everyone expected. It was a deep, throaty growl that vibrated through the floorboards and up the legs of the velvet chairs in the front row. It sounded like a cello, dark and full of secrets. For the first 5 seconds, nobody moved. The sound was so different from the polished, pretty music the orchestra had played earlier. This sound was raw. It was real. Ilora's eyes were still closed, but behind her eyelids, she wasn't seeing the school or the stage. She was seeing the cold nights she spent waiting for her mother to come home. She was feeling the frustration of being ignored, of being laughed at. She poured all that feeling into the instrument. The old violin, which looked like a piece of junk, suddenly came alive under her chin. The wood seemed to hum with a voice that was too big for such a small body. The piece, Zijayunerwezen, started slowly. It was sad and pleading. Ilora moved her body with the music, swaying slightly. She wasn't standing stiff like a statue like the other students had. She let the music move her. Her fingers pressed down on the strings, creating notes that wept. The people in the front row stopped whispering. The man who had been checking his phone slowly lowered it to his lap, his eyes fixed on the girl in the simple blue dress. Then, the music changed. The sad, slow part ended, and the fast, wild part began. This was the part Mr. Thorne had bet she couldn't play. It required the left hand to jump up and down the neck of the violin at a blinding speed. Ilora didn't hesitate. She attacked the strings. Suddenly, the tempo sped up. The sound became a frantic, gypsy dance. Her right arm moved the bow so fast it looked like a blur of motion. Her left fingers danced across the strings, finding every note with deadly accuracy. The music was no longer sad, it was fierce. It was angry and joyful at the same time. It sounded like a storm swirling around the room. The audience sat frozen. You could feel the energy in the room change completely. The judgment evaporated. The pity vanished. People were no longer looking at a poor scholarship student, they were looking at a master. The sound filled every corner of the giant hall. It bounced off the high ceiling. It was rich and warm, filled with a passion that money couldn't buy. Even Mr. Thorne couldn't look away. He had been sitting with his arms crossed, waiting for her to mess up. He was waiting for the bow to slip or for her fingers to miss a note. But the mistake never came. Instead of relaxing, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. His smug smile began to fade, replaced by a look of confusion and then, slowly, shock. He looked at the battered violin, then back at Ilora's face. He realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had thought the instrument made the musician, but he was being proven wrong in the most public way possible. Ilora felt sweat rolling down her back, but she didn't care. Her fingers burned with the effort, but she welcomed the pain. She was in her own world now. She wasn't afraid of the crowd anymore. She wasn't afraid of the teacher. She was the master of this moment. She hit the high notes so high and sharp they could easily sound terrible if played by a novice. But she played them with a crystal clear purity that cut through the air like a sharp knife. The orchestra students backstage were peering through the curtains. Their mouths were open. Some of them, the ones with the expensive instruments who had looked down on her, were now looking at each other with wide eyes. They knew how hard that song was. They knew they couldn't play it that well. For the first time, they saw Elora not as the quiet girl, but as a musician to be respected. The music reached its peak. It was a whirlwind of sound, a flurry of notes that seemed impossible for one person to produce. Elora's hair fell into her face, but she didn't brush it away. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving, pouring every last ounce of energy into the violin. The sound swelled, louder and louder, filling the entire space with a golden, roaring intensity. She hit the final run, a fast stream of notes that tumbled down the scale like waterfalls. She played it perfectly, her fingers landing exactly where they were supposed to, faster than the eye could follow. Then, she lifted her bow high, cutting off the sound abruptly in the middle of a breath. Silence. Not the polite silence of waiting for the song to end. Not the bored silence of people checking their watches. It was a heavy, shocked silence. The kind of silence where the air feels electric because something amazing just happened. The sound of the violin seemed to hang in the air, a ghost that refused to leave. Hundreds of people sat in their seats, stunned. No one breathed. No one moved. Elora stood there, chest heaving, her hands shaking from the adrenaline and the effort. She slowly opened her eyes. The bright spotlight blinded her for a moment. She looked out into the darkness of the audience, but she couldn't see them. She just felt the silence. For a second, fear gripped her heart again. Did I mess up, she thought. Why is it so quiet? She lowered her violin, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped the bow. She stood there, small and alone on the giant stage, waiting for the judgment to fall. But the judgment wasn't coming from the audience. The judgment had just been delivered to Mr. Thorne. The silence was the sound of their expectations being shattered. She was just a girl in a blue dress with an old violin. But for 3 minutes, she had owned the world. The silence stretched on, heavy and waiting, building the pressure until it felt like the room would explode. Then, it happened. A man in the front row, an older gentleman with a gray beard, slowly stood up. He didn't clap at first. He just looked at Elora with a look of pure wonder. Then, he brought his hands together. Clap. It was a single, loud sound that broke the heavy quiet. It was like a dam breaking. Suddenly, the entire auditorium erupted. It wasn't just clapping, it was a roar. People jumped to their feet in a single, massive wave. The sound was deafening, filling the hall like a thunderstorm. Whistles pierced the air, and voices shouted bravo. An encore. Elora stood there, frozen in the spotlight. Her ears were ringing, not from the music this time, but from the wall of noise hitting her. For a second, she didn't understand what was happening. She blinked rapidly, looking out at the sea of people. They weren't bored. They weren't whispering. They were on their feet, screaming for her. She saw a woman in a fancy gown wiping tears from her eyes with a handkerchief. She saw a man with a camera frantically taking pictures. Mr. Thorne was still sitting. While the rest of the room was a chaotic celebration, he was an island of stillness. His arms hung loosely at his sides, his clipboard forgotten on the floor next to his chair. He was staring at Illyra, his mouth slightly open. For the first time in years, he looked like he didn't know what to do. He looked at the battered violin in her hands, then at the adoring crowd, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. He had tried to humiliate her, but instead, he had set a lion free. Illyra's legs felt like jelly. She realized she was supposed to bow. She tried to remember the proper bow she had been taught in etiquette classes, knees straight, back flat, but she was too exhausted. Instead, she just bent awkwardly at the waist, clutching her violin. It wasn't graceful, but it was honest. The crowd roared even louder. They didn't care about her posture, they cared about the magic she had just created. She quickly straightened up and turned to walk off the stage. The spotlight followed her for a moment before finally shutting off, plunging the wings into darkness. As soon as she stepped out of the light, she nearly collapsed. A stagehand rushed forward to catch her elbow, steadying her. "You did it," the stagehand whispered, her eyes wide. "You were amazing." Illyra could barely breathe. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. She allowed the woman to guide her toward the dressing rooms, but before she could go all the way back, she had to walk past the orchestra entrance. Mr. Thorne was still on stage, trying to calm the audience down for the next part of the show, but he looked defeated. She slipped into the narrow hallway backstage. It was crowded with students waiting to go on or coming off. Usually, this hallway was filled with gossip and laughter. Tonight, it was dead silent. As Illyra walked past, clutching her old violin case, the other students parted like the Red Sea. They moved against the lockers to let her pass. They weren't looking at her with pity or mockery anymore. They were looking at her with fear and respect. The quiet girl in the back row had just become the most powerful person in the building. Illyra kept her head down, not wanting to see their faces. She just wanted to be alone. She found a small bench near the emergency exit and sat down. Her whole body was shaking now, the adrenaline fading away and leaving her cold and exhausted. She looked down at her hands. Her fingertips were red and sore. She took a deep breath, trying to stop the tears that were finally coming. Then, she saw a shadow fall over her. She looked up. It was Mr. Thorne. He had come off stage. He stood towering over her, looking stiff and uncomfortable. For a moment, Illyra flinched, expecting him to scold her for bowing incorrectly or for running off stage too quickly. She braced herself for the insult. But it never came. Mr. Thorne looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time all year. He looked at her simple dress, her worn-out shoes, and the battered violin case. His face was no longer cruel. It was complicated. He looked like a man who had just watched a ghost walk through the wall. He started, then stopped. He cleared his throat. He adjusted his jacket, trying to regain his composure, trying to find the teacher he was before the concert. He didn't say he was sorry. He was too proud for that. But he didn't have to. The intonation on the high E was, surprisingly sharp, he said quietly. It was the closest thing to a compliment he could give. He sighed, shaking his head slowly. I have taught at this school for 30 years. I thought I knew what talent looked like. I thought it came with a price tag. He looked at the old violin case. I was wrong. Illyra just looked at him. She didn't know what to say. She didn't need him to tell her she was good anymore. She knew it now. She felt it in her bones. Mr. Thorne shifted his weight. He stepped aside, clearing the path to the exit door. "Go home, Ilora," he said softly. "Get some rest. We will discuss your future, on Monday." He didn't say if you have a future. He said discuss. Ilora stood up slowly. She picked up her case. She walked past Mr. Thorne. As she went by the door, she stopped. She didn't look at him, but she spoke. "It wasn't the violin, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "It was the music." She pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped out into the cool night air. Outside, the city was alive. Cars honked in the distance, and the street lights hummed. Ilora took a deep breath of the fresh air. She felt different. The fear that had been weighing her down for months was gone. She wasn't the invisible girl anymore. She wasn't the charity case. She was a musician. She walked toward the bus stop, her step a little lighter. The battered violin case bumped against her leg, a familiar rhythm. It was still the same old case. It was still scratched and held together by tape. But when she opened it next, the world would hear it differently. And so would she. She smiled to herself, a small, genuine smile, as the city lights reflected in her eyes. The cruel teacher had tried to break her, but he had only made her stronger. And now, she knew exactly who she was. She sat there, listening to them play, and for the rest of the class, she didn't count the tiles on the floor. She started planning. She didn't know how yet, but she knew she couldn't let him win. Not completely.